Hi, my name is Malcolm. I'm uh, I'm hailing from Singapore, so I'm a practicing lawyer in Singapore. I have my own firm, and I also have an advisory company called Gravitas International. And we've worked on the digital asset space over the last 2.5 to 3 years. We've worked on over 80 ICO, IEO, STO projects, and we can take them from cradle to grave. So basically, starting with advisory services, and then we do structuring, whether it's in Singapore or other parts of the world, depending on what the project needs. And we help with the business aspects, which is white paper writing, tokenomics, structuring, and prospectus writing or PPMs for security products. Fourthly, we do the marketing and distribution, which is the bulk of any of these kinds of fundraising. We do social media, community management, etc. And lastly, of course, there's technology. So we help with the minting of the coins and tokenizing of businesses. And in certain cases, we help with the application building and the DApps creations. So that's what we do at my advisory company. I'm also an author of a book, How to ICO in Singapore. So this was first published, the first edition was in October 2017. And the second edition was published May last year. So I'm here today to give an update on legal and regulatory updates, new Payment Services Act regime in Singapore, which came in effect since January 2020. And basically, what's the landscape in Singapore right now? What are the legal regulatory updates in the fintech and digital asset space? So it's a bit heavy going. And if there are any questions from anybody joining the room, feel free to ask the questions. I'll try my best to answer them. So right now, I'll just launch straight into the Payment Services Act. Now, a bit of background. So in Singapore, prior to January 2020, there was no regulation for crypto in Singapore. Basically, as long as it's not a security, it's regarded as a commodity. And firstly, it is not taxed unless you're trading. Trading is your main business, then trading profits are taxed. Otherwise, Singapore has a zero capital gains tax regime, and profits from trading of digital assets is not taxed. And in Singapore, since 2020 January, there is a new Payment Services Act that has come into effect, which means that 7 different categories of businesses will now come under this regime. So what are the 7 categories? Firstly, account issuance. So basically, if you are a digital wallet provider, or if you're an exchange and you're providing digital wallets to people, then you will need to have this business category under the license. Secondly, there is the category of domestic transfers. So if you are operating a business which allows clients to transfer money to each other within Singapore, that's domestic transfer. Thirdly is cross-border transfers. So this is a basic remittance license. So sending money and funds across countries internationally, that's a remittance license in Singapore. Fourthly would be merchant acquisition. So basically, if you're allowing APIs and providing merchant gateways, payment gateways, and providing payment service provider types of services, then merchant acquisition is something that you would need. For example, if you're running, let's say, an Alipay or WeChat Pay business and allowing people to connect to your portal and make payments, so that's the definition of merchant acquisition. The fifth category under the new licensing regime is e-money. So e-money in Singapore used to be called the stored value facility. Basically, if you're transferring a digital representation of a fiat currency, for example, sterling pound or euro or US dollar or Sing dollar, and it's a digitized form, then that's considered as e-money. Interestingly enough, Singapore also regards stable coins in the crypto world as a e-money category. So basically, tethers and let's say USDT, USDC, TUSD, GUSD, etc. Any kinds of these stable coins are also regarded as e-money. So this is the license subcategory under the Payment Services Act. So if you're dealing with such stable coins as a platform operator, as an exchange or as a P2P dealer, then you would need this license. The sixth license category is digital payment tokens. So Singapore takes a view that most utility tokens are considered as digital payment tokens. So under this category would be most of the altcoins out there and Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, Ether, Dash, Binance Coin, etc. All these are considered as digital payment tokens. So basically, exchanges can now come to Singapore and register for business activity under digital payment tokens dealing, and they can then operate their business legally. So this is a huge impact for the industry, which I'll come to in short order right after I finish the 7 categories. The types of businesses getting a DPT license, a digital payment token license, would be crypto exchanges, OTC platform operators, and token issuers. So previously, if you were a token issuer, a lot of them flocked to Singapore to run their ICOs, primarily because Singapore didn't have any strict regulations with regards to token issuance. But right now, if you're a token issuer, you would need to get a payment services license in order to operate in Singapore. The last category under the Payment Services Act is the money changing license. So right now, under the grandfathering scheme of the Payment Services Act, existing license holders for money changing licenses, remittance licenses, and some stored value facilities licenses, which is now renamed as e-money, are already grandfathered into the scheme and they have a license. So Singapore has 3 different types of or 3 tiers of institutions. Firstly, there is the SPI, Standard Payment Institution, where the amount of money that you can transact, the value of money that you can transact in these payment categories is less than 3 million per month. If you have 2 or more categories, then this can go up to 6 million per month. And if you are a major payment institution, then there's no limit on the float or the transaction volume that you can provide services for. And the third category or different type of licensee would be the money changers. So if you are going for a solo business category, just money changing, then you will be fitting in under the money changing license regime. So these are the a basic overview of the different categories, as well as the types of organizations that can exist under this licensing regime. Now, why would people want to come to Singapore to set this up? Now, those in the crypto space, in the digital asset space, can think back to 2018 when there was massive publicity in January 2018 when Gibraltar first rolled out the new laws that were coming into effect, saying that they are the most crypto-friendly jurisdiction in the world. Shortly after, the rival sibling, basically Malta, came up with an announcement that they would be the crypto island of the world. And there was a lot of fanfare. Binance was the poster child for Malta. And even now in some sites, Binance is named as a Maltese entity. So when Binance raised the flag in Malta, many dozens of other exchanges and dozens of other projects decided to also go to Malta to set up shop there. And jurisdiction shopping is something very interesting and unique in this industry. So because every country treats digital assets and cryptocurrencies differently, so a phenomenon that is well known is that token issuers and projects that want to issue digital assets will shop around the world to choose the most favorable jurisdiction. So Singapore has always been one of the top 3 to 5 jurisdictions in the world for cryptocurrencies and digital assets. And now with the advent of the Payment Services Act, I would dare say that it has become more institutionalized. So what's in it for project owners and enterprises and companies who want to do their offerings in Singapore? Basically, if you are a token issuer and you come to Singapore and get a license, you can operate your business legally and you will be able to attract institutional funds. So as we know, the space has changed dramatically. It used to be a retail-only, consumer-only space back in 2017 and early 2018. And then institutions and family offices and enterprises started coming into the space. So the monies raised from the space became more or less 50-50 in terms of retail versus enterprise level and institution level. And increasingly, that percentage has gone up. So less and less retail money is going into new projects, and more enterprise and institutional level funding is coming into the space. So the cryptocurrency and the ICO space is looking increasingly like a typical VC angel seed funding type of round, and more private sales are going on rather than public sales. So that's basically a function of the declining cryptocurrency industry in terms of the amount of money in the total float of all the coins, as well as a function of failed projects, because just as any other startup in any other industry, there's 80 to 90% failure rate for startups that raise money through ICOs. So basically, ICOs are a global or international crowd fund. And of course, every country nowadays more or less has its own crowdfunding laws, because crowdfunding is very similar to securities law, except that it's pitched at the retail level consumers. So in essence, when ICOs came about, this phenomenon captured the world's imagination in 2017, early 2018. So a lot of money poured into the space, and there was a lot of public interest. But that has died down with the declining prices of coins. That's something that hopefully will reverse. Now it seems to be quite bullish sentiment because of the recent halving of Bitcoin, and that might lead to a same situation as the last two times that halving occurred in 2012 and 2016, when after the halving event, the price of Bitcoin basically went 10x up. So a lot of industry players, a lot of institutions are now getting in the space and watching this very carefully, especially since there's so much free and cheap liquidity in the markets right now, with all the stimulus packages and the aid and the loosening of monetary controls around the world by all the central governments. And most other asset classes have dropped. Basically, if you look at the last 3 months, the only asset classes that have really gone up would be gold and Bitcoin, right? Even in the equities market, the vast majority of counters are down. Only the big tech companies are still up over this time frame. So coming back to the Payment Services Act, why does this make such a big difference, and what's in it for people, right? So essentially, those of you who are familiar with the funding space, with the institutional space, would know that all institutions have a mandate. So this mandate is basically a command, a list of commands, right? Beyond which they cannot operate. So if you have a mandate that requires something regulated, so obviously that institution or the family office or the high net worth investor will not be able to invest in something that's unregulated. So because cryptocurrencies were formerly mostly unregulated, that's what's preventing a lot of institutions from getting into the space, unless their mandate gives them a totally open allocation in terms of what they can choose to invest in. But most institutions and most funds are very limited in this aspect. So this is a major change. With the advent of the Payment Services Act, now in Singapore, it becomes a fully regulated activity, meaning that institutional money, high net worth money, accredited investor money will now start flowing massively into this space. Macroeconomic situations and the global climate and economy is also pointing to this direction. Why do I say that? Now, basically, China since last year, and in fact, since 2017, there were already rumors of this happening. But since last year, the Chinese central government came out to say that the digital yuan will be out very soon. It might be as soon as this year or sometime next year. When that happens, basically, they're going to remove all physical money. And the entire RMB, renminbi, or Chinese yuan currency will be digitized. Now that's going to be a massive change for the world because China is aggressively pushing its One Belt One Road initiative and trying to basically buy its way into a lot of economies and create these partnerships. Now imagine if all the Chinese money is digitized. So essentially, they would now be able to reach out to all trading partners who might then adopt the digital yuan as its trading currency. And that will definitely raise alarm bells in the US because then the US dominance of the petrodollar will be severely challenged. And not only China will be doing this, many countries at this juncture are also looking at CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. So if a central bank issues digital representations of its money and no longer needs to depend on paper money, this will cause massive changes in the financial economy. And once digital assets are commonplace, the common person is very used to dealing with digital assets, then the rise of all these digital assets and cryptocurrencies will take place. The industry will grow from its current 260 billion market cap, definitely, in my view, overtake the previous high of 830 billion from January 2018. And I believe it will be many, many trillions in the coming 1 or 2 decades. So right now, there are four traditional classes of assets. Firstly, there is the commodities, then there are equities, real estate, and cash and equivalents. And my firm belief is that digital assets will become the fifth asset class. Now, each of these asset classes are easily 10 to 200 trillion. And on top of these four main asset classes, there are derivatives which amount to over 500 trillion by themselves, right? Derivatives of these underlying four asset classes. Now, with digital assets coming into the space, uh, it will easily, in my opinion, easily exceed 100 trillion because digital assets are a very easy form of conversion. So basically, physical assets, the old asset classes, can easily be fractionalized and converted into digitized forms. And once it becomes digital, then it's so much easier to deal with them, so much easier to trade with them, so much easier to monitor them. So I believe that the macro trends in the world economy are pointing towards this. Interestingly enough, the COVID-19 situation has now forced the hand of many central governments to strongly consider issuing their own apps, which will be able to dispense the free liquidity or the cheap liquidity to their citizens and to the rescue packages to the economy, small businesses that severely require such rescue packages to stay afloat. And when that happens, then the world will be transformed. Digital assets will take will be forefront, will be right in front in the stage, and paper money will be slowly phased out in many countries. Another interesting case study is India. In fact, those of you who have observed India over the last few years will notice that in one fell swoop, in 1 year, Modi, the Prime Minister of India, managed to eliminate large currency notes, large physical money, and that basically gave the government a lot of control over the entire financial system in India. And similarly, they instituted a countrywide initiative, and this is really amazing to me. In 1 year, they managed to get basically 1.3 billion people thumbprinted. So everybody has a biometric thumbprint, and this allows them to be digitized and enter into the system. So imagine if governments start rolling this out, starting with the two largest populated countries, China and India. That would mean that close to 3 billion people in the world will be using digital assets. And of course, the rest of the world will start following. In Europe, many countries are already considering rolling out their own CBDCs. In the US, because of the party politics, the Democrats and Republicans are both coming out with their own agendas and pushing the use of CBDCs and minting basically of additional free liquidity. So in my view, these are interesting macro trends that will bring digital assets to the forefront. And this leads me back to my conversation today about why the new Payment Services Act in Singapore is a very big change in the world economy. Singapore is one of the main financial centers of the world. By rolling out a friendly, digital asset friendly regime, will then be able to take a lead in terms of the digital asset space. And when this happens, when traditional fiat money flows into the digitized space, it's much easier. It's a much easier flow. It's a much easier way for central governments to dispense money and to control their monetary policy. So these are, in my view, certain macro trends, certain angles that everyone should be looking out for. My firm belief is that over the next year, many CBDCs will come out. A much larger market capitalization will occur within a year from now. And if we are following the trends from 2012 and 2016, the Bitcoin halving will have a massive effect as well, and the price of Bitcoin will probably double or triple from the present day price at the very least. So these are all interesting changes. What we are very involved in right now in Singapore, from my law firm and my advisory company, is helping companies and clients to get their licenses in place. In fact, over the first 2 months of 2020, over 400 applicants threw their names into the hat to get license exemptions, and indicating to the central bank in Singapore that they'll be applying for licenses once the Payment Services Act comes in effect as of July. So basically, there's an exemption period from January until July this year, where if you are an exempted entity, you can carry on the business that you were doing before the act took effect. And subsequent to July 2020, all entities who want to transact in these 7 different business types will have to get a Payment Services Act license in Singapore. So this is a very brief overview. I'm limited by time, and I hope that the audience here can understand, given the fast pace of what I have described. But if any of you would like any notes or for me to answer any questions, please feel free to key in your questions right now, or you can try to reach out to me and I will give you a more detailed answer. I'm going to text my, let's see, how do I text? Okay, I'm going to text my contact details. So anyone who's interested can just email me or text me on Telegram. So my law firm email address is coming up, as well as my Telegram handle. Okay, so I have a bit of time to take any questions if there are any from the floor. And if not, then I'm well in time before the next session by Laura. Let's see if Laura is here. Not here yet, so I'll carry on talking. Any questions? If there are no questions, let me describe a couple of other legal and regulatory hotspots in Singapore. So firstly, let me give a very quick overview about the sandbox regime. So in Singapore, as with a few other common law countries, has a sandbox regime under the central bank in place. So under the sandbox, it is encouraged for any financial innovations, financial and technology innovations in the space to come forth, get into the sandbox, and be observed by the regulators for a period of 6 to 12 months, after which there will be a license offer if everything checks out. If not, there will be learning points that will be given to the project that's in the sandbox, and if they take that on, eventually they will get a license, and it's again up to their choice, right? So this is something that's quite popular in Singapore as well. Some applicants are going for, especially in industries like insurance, like insurtech, as well as recognized market operators, basically exchanges, right? So securities exchanges. So sandbox is something that's interesting in Singapore. Another interesting development is the VCC. So those of you who are investors or fund managers or familiar with the private equity space will be interested to find out that Singapore has a new law, which is called the VCC, Variable Capital Company, which essentially allows Singaporean companies to now be structured as a master feeder structure. So the US citizens here will be very familiar with the Cayman structure. So in essence, now Singapore offers the same as a Cayman structure. You can come to Singapore, set up a company, register it as a VCC, and set up a master feeder structure, meaning that each of the funds, the sub-funds that are under an SPC structure like this, will be separate and segregated. And this is a massive advantage because previously it was not possible to set up a master feeder fund structure or a SPC structure in Singapore. But now with the advent of the variable capital company in Singapore, it's possible to do that. So previous fund structures in Singapore would essentially be Cayman masters, and sub funds might be in Singapore, run by investment managers from Singapore. But now with the variable capital company structures in Singapore, uh, clients can easily come to Singapore, set up the entire master feeder structure and the sub funds in Singapore. So everything would be run from here. The advantage of being in Singapore as opposed to Cayman is, of course, proximity to commerce and to talent. Singapore being a financial hub, being a gateway to Asia, being a gateway between East and West, it's a much more business-driven and attractive destination for international business. And if the same structures can be offered in Singapore as opposed to Cayman, it's a lower cost to run it in Singapore, and it's easier to find talent. It's easier to find investments. There are easily trillions of dollars of liquidity in Singapore that are looking for good projects to attach themselves to. So these are things that will be offered to companies or owners who want to set up their fund structures in Singapore. So this is, I would say, another interesting development in Singapore. So I still don't see the next speaker, but there is I guess the next one, Ricky Thomas, right? Is that Richard Thomas?
I think I'm off to the next speaker.
Okay.
On the
Yeah,
10:30.
the next speaker is not here yet. Okay. So any questions from my fellow speakers here?